There's going to be two parts to my talk. In the beginning, I want you to bear with me for 5 or so minutes while I talk a little bit about brain development, and then I'm going to dive into the introduction to this project, the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, and turn things over to my colleagues to really talk about the findings themselves. So the first part will be, how does experience impact the developing brain? The second part will be, what are the effects of profound psychosocial deprivation on brain development? I'll talk a little bit then about the history of institutional care over the ages. I'll talk about institutional care in Romania, and then I'll introduce the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. So, the first thing to note that who we are as individuals is a product of both the genes we inherit from our parents and our experiences. And as a result, our genes basically specify the properties of brain cells and the connections among brain cells. But because many aspects of the environment aren't predictable, each individual brain is built differently. So even identical twins who share 100% of their DNA, even raised in the same family, have different patterns of brain development because they incorporate experience differently. So it's highly individualized. But it's important to note that some experiences are, or at least should be, common to all members of the species. For example, seeing light, hearing sound, having a caregiver. And these basically help ensure survival. Whoops. But others optimize development. So it's one thing to have an impersonal caregiver in an institutional environment, prop a bottle up in a baby's mouth. But it's another to have a sensitive, consistent, invested caregiver that would help the child, or to hear age-appropriate language or age-appropriate cognitive stimulation. And in many cases, both classes of experience have to occur during a particular window of time, what we call a critical period or a sensitive period, for development to proceed along a typical developmental trajectory. The way we think of critical periods is a point in development when the brain is particularly receptive to experience. The thing that we would all understand is how much easier it is for a young child to learn a language than it would be for an adult to learn another language. So the way we can illustrate this is with this slide. So what you can see here is this is development. This would be birth. This would be the other end of the lifespan. The y-axis represents the amount of plasticity your brain has, that is, its potential to change. And what you can see is that the peak represents the maximum point of plasticity. And you'll notice that for sensory systems like seeing and hearing, the peak occurs a little bit before it does for motor or language, and it occurs way before higher cognition, emotion regulation, and things like that. But the point here is that the downward slope means you're losing plasticity. So you'll see here that there are different critical periods for different domains. So here's what I want to show you. The red line represents plasticity declining with age. And so as you can see here, here's birth, here's, let's say, the age of 70. I made this graph many years ago. Now I'd like to go out to 100. But you can see that there's a dramatic decline in plasticity as we get older. And the reason for that is there's a dramatic increase in the physiologic effort required to change the brain. And you'll notice that around here is when it gets increasingly more difficult to do things. Now, we all have plasticity throughout the lifespan. I like to use my mother as an example, who's almost 98. She uses a cell phone, she uses a computer, she uses a GPS on her car. She will call me very soon to explain that something's not working, but the fact is she's managed to learn this technology. So we have that kind of plasticity, but we don't have the type that allows us to see better or hear better, or to do certain motor things, which I can illustrate in just a minute. So the point is, many elements of postnatal brain development adhere to this principle of critical periods. Most critical periods occur during a rapid period of brain development, generally the first few years of life. To put this in perspective, A synapse is the connection between two brain cells. That's how the brain works with circuits. Between the very end of the prenatal period and the 3rd year of life, babies are building 1,000 synapses a second. So if you do the math, you can see the sheer number of synapses that are being produced. The second point is that after a critical period has passed, it gets increasingly difficult to acquire a skill or to change the brain. And the big question is whether or not we can figure out a way to rescue a critical period. That is, if you've gone through a critical period without appropriate experience, and this is, as you can see here, can you open it up again? So imagine at the age of 50, you decide to learn golf, or to learn another language, or to master some other skill that you never mastered earlier. There are increasingly pharmacological ways to do this, although they're still very experimental. But imagine the promise for therapy for this. This means that if a child has suffered greatly in the early years of life, didn't get help, but now they're 20 or 30 or 40, there may be treatment approaches to help them. This is the future. So, moving along. So, the next topic is, what are the effects of profound deprivation on development? And the way to think of this is, what happens to brain development when there's a profound violation of the expectable environment? And the expectable environment is simply, when we're born, we expect certain things: to be fed, to be held, to be soothed, to be stimulated, and the like. So what happens when children fail to receive the stimulation necessary to foster healthy brain development? And particularly, this is true for those raised in institutional settings. So, neglect is the most common form of child maltreatment, at least in the US, but I think in many parts of the world. And one way to think of neglect is the deprivation of basic experiences that should be present in the lives of all children, such as high-quality caregiving, social and cognitive stimulation, meeting a child's basic needs for safety and security, like housing security, food security, and the like. A particularly egregious form of neglect is being raised in an institutional environment, I think, as we all know, which often involves conditions of profound psychosocial deprivation. So, in 1920, a group of us working with the Lancet defined an institution as a non-family-based, public or privately staffed collective living arrangement for children. This includes, but is not limited to, so-called orphanages, children's institutions, group homes, infant homes, children's villages, and similar residential care facilities for kids. I now want to briefly turn to the history of institutionalization over the centuries to give you some perspective of where we are now. So institutional care was a preferred form of care for orphan or abandoned children for many years. So in antiquity, there was informal adoption. During the Dark Ages, there were nunneries and monasteries. Middle Ages and Renaissance was the beginning of foundling homes. I'll show you some pictures in a moment. In the 18th and 19th centuries, when institutions became ascendant, that became the preferred form of care for abandoned children or children whose parents had died, or biological orphans. And through the 20th and 21st century, foster care in many parts of the world became the dominant form of care for children who didn't have parents or whose parents gave them up. So as you can see here, let me put all this up. So at the top you have London foundling hospitals dating back to the late 1800s. And then in the bottom here is the first orphanage in the United States, 1790 in Charleston, South Carolina. This is something that happened during the early part of the 20th century when orphans were put on trains in usually the East Coast of the United States and shipped to families in the Midwest, often farming families who wanted these kids to work on the farms. And this is beautifully illustrated in this book called The Orphan Train, which I recommend. So, to tell you how far back people raised questions about the wisdom of institutional care, there was a White House conference in 1909 the theme here is children should be placed in families, not in institutions. So this was 1909 that this was pronounced. If children cannot be in families, they should be raised in a family-like setting. So this is the highly regarded medical journal, the Journal of the American Medical Association, from 1915. What this is telling us is the best conditions for the infant thus require a home and a mother. The further we get away from these vital necessities of beginning life, the greater will be our failure to get adequate results to help the needy infant. Strange to say, these important conditions are often overlooked, or at least not sufficiently emphasized by those working in the field. So here we have, more than 120 years ago, people recognizing the hazards of institutional care, and yet that continues. So, in other words, this is an old problem for which we need new solutions. And this leads me to introduce the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. So, you all know the history of Romania. In 1989, the Ceausescu regime fell, and with that, there was the aftermath. So more than, Kelly said 150,000, sometimes we say 170,000 children were warehoused in state-run institutions. Poverty was the #1 reason for child abandonment. The international media brought the attention to the world of the plight of these children, and many of these children started to be adopted at homes in Canada, Great Britain, and the United States. Here's a scene from a movie I took in roughly 2000 of St. Catherine's, #1 in Bucharest. And what I want you to pay attention to is this little girl here. Now, first notice how many children are in this room and how few caregivers are in the room. Notice that the caregiver is really doing nothing more but, just sort of touching the child. And then I want you to start noticing the stereotypies that you can see in these children. So right over here, you'll see them in just a second. These children are starting to rock. And let me go back. Watch what this little girl does in a second. Walks by and smacks that kid. Charlie, this is... Now, notice the sheer number of kids who are engaging in this rocking stereotypy. Then another caregiver comes in with some more kids. But you notice the kind of caregiving these children are getting. Really, none. These are pictures of what institutions look like at this point in time. So the question is, why is institutional rearing bad for the brain? So it's insensitive care, it's a regimented daily schedule, non-individualized care, sensory, social, emotional deprivation. It's isolation, no response to distress or unchecked aggression, a lack of caregiver investment, so there are rotating shifts of caregivers, high ratio of children to caregivers. We have known for many years that children raised in institutions are at a dramatically high risk for a variety of cognitive, social, and behavioral problems, including disturbances in attachment and social relatedness, externalizing behavior problems, acting out behavior, inattention and hyperactivity, deficits in IQ and executive functions, and a syndrome that mimics autism, and then growth stunting. So the way to think of this is that we have a continuum of caregiving. So at the far left, we would have street children or dangerous families, and then large institutions, then smaller group settings, then foster care, and then high quality foster care. There's overwhelming consistent evidence favoring foster care over institutional care, which you'll hear more about from my colleagues. And generally, although there are exceptions, family preservation often has poor results. So particularly when substances are involved, drug use, for example. So why do we conduct this study in Romania? There were tens of thousands of institutionalized children in the country, mostly abandoned at birth. We had the opportunity to look at early experience in young children. We were invited into the country to do this study by the then Minister of Child Protection, Cristian Tăvăcaru, and we had an interest in developing policies for intervening in the lives of abandoned children and to compare institutional care to foster care. Before I do the study design, I should say that when we began the study, many people told us this was a waste of time, that the state would do a better job of raising children than families would, and that we were going to find no effects at all, that children in foster care would do no better than institutional care, in part because of this principle of defectology, that the children in institutions were already defective, so any syndrome or behavioral disturbances we saw wasn't due to being in an institution, it was due to something they were born with. So when we started the study, we had the risk of not showing an effect, in which case the government would say, well, we were right, kids should be raised in institutions. So here's the study design. That's a study design? Yeah, okay. So this is the first ever randomized controlled trial of foster care as an intervention for the social deprivation associated with institutionalization. We screened more than 180, mostly babies, to make sure they didn't have frank neurological or genetic or other congenital anomalies. So we wanted a sample of kids we thought would be typically developing, and we can come back to that in the context of the 700 that you need to deinstitutionalize, many of whom have special needs. After the physical exams were done, we identified 136 children that looked to be healthy and typically developing. We assessed them all, and then half of them were randomly assigned to a foster care program that we, Charlie in particular, set up and financed and maintained. And another 68 were randomly assigned to remain in institutional care. Now, before I go on, we were not withholding care. We could only identify 58 foster care families. And what we did is we placed 68 children in those 58 families with another ethical principle of keeping siblings together. So we were not withholding care. And then finally, we identified 72 never institutionalized children living in the greater Bucharest community, but many of them born at the same maternity hospitals as the institutionalized kids. So it was a coarse way of controlling for social class. Following baseline assessment, we saw the children again at 9, 18, 30, and 42 months, then again at 54 months. And it was around then that we thought we were going to end the study. However, up until this point, the MacArthur Foundation was supporting the work. We then finally started to approach the National Institutes of Health, and we saw the children again at 8 years of age, 12 years of age, 16 years of age. We have just finished or about to finish a 21, 22-year follow-up. And we're hoping to do one more wave of follow-up, because what we're seeing when they've made the transition from adolescence to young adulthood gives us pause for concern how they're going to negotiate the next part of the lifespan as they move into their later 20s. So here's the study design. Let me put all this up. So basically, the institutional group of 136 was split into foster care and care as usual. Then there was a never institutional group, and then we followed these children up until age of 21. The question was, what should we assess in these children? And this is where the arguing began, because the three of us could never really agree on what was the most important thing to study. And so what we did is we pretty much studied everything: physical development, language development, social functioning. We characterized the caregiving environment, cognitive development, temperament, attachment, brain function, brain structure, genetics and epigenetics, and psychopathology. Some of the ethical considerations, as I've already alluded to this, that all the universities in the U.S. had to approve, their ethics reviews had to approve the study. Randomization, there had been inherent bias in previous studies looking at post-institutionalized children, because the issue was who gets to be adopted. And it was often the better behaved or better looking kids. And there's sample bias. So this is an opportunity to work around that. We had the opportunity to change policy in Romania, which we were successful at, we think. And without the study, all the children in the care as usual group would go back to an institution. There was no more than minimal risk for participation, so we weren't doing anything that we hadn't already done in the United States or other parts of the world. In work like this is often what's called a stop rule. So if you're doing a study and the effects are very successful, the option is to give everybody the treatment or to stop the study. In our case, we couldn't, if we stopped the study, all the children would go back to the institution. And on the other hand, we didn't have enough foster care to put the kids in foster care. So what we did instead is we called a press conference, and we invited members of the government, and we announced our findings about 2 years in that basically were showing that foster care children were doing better than the institutionalized children. And we finally had a policy of non-interference, which meant that if children were to change their placement status, the government would come in and take a child in the institution and reunite them with their biological family, or a child could be adopted. We never got in the way of that. That naturally happened. And as a result, over the course of the study, the vast majority of children in the institutional group left the institution. Probably by the time they were, more than half were gone by the time they were 8. But as you'll hear from my colleagues, we analyzed the data based on the original group assignment. It's called intent to treat. And the reason is if we only looked at the kids who changed their assignment, there's still bias. Why did some kids change their placement settings versus others? And then, as I said, we provided data to the government as soon as it came in. So a little bit about the intervention. High-quality foster care, families received a monthly stipend equivalent to the average per capita income in Romania at the time. Families were closely monitored. Social workers visited the families roughly every 10 days, and they met with us in the U.S. every 7 days using Skype. We provided all material support. There was a 24-hour on-call pediatrician. Romania law required one parent to stay at home with the child, and all families were licensed. So it was a child-centered model of foster care, orchestrated around the needs of the child for a stable, consistent, emotionally available caregiver. The foster parent became emotionally invested in the child and advocated for that child as if it were their own child. And the social workers supported the family, monitored and intervened when the foster care families were struggling at times. So we did constant interventions at that level. And we had weekly consultations with clinicians. Now, before we turn to the findings, I should say that the advantage of doing a study over 20 years is we can actually see individual development of children over the years. And the question for us were, would the efficacy of the intervention, that you'll hear more about in just a moment, would it persist or would it go away? In the literature on early intervention studies, it turns out many interventions wash out. Our intervention was designed to build relationships. It wasn't designed to make the kids smarter or better functioning. And yet, you will see, when you hear from my colleagues, the reality is that we improved many aspects of development simply by fostering relationships. So the last thing I'll note, besides here's a book that we published through the data through age 8 years, is to end with a quote from Nelson Mandela. There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way it treats its children. And that's something I think we should all keep in mind as we move through the rest of the day. So on that note, I'll invite Dr. Zina up.